Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Luke's Sunday Forum. We're thrilled to have you here. We are about to have an amazingly substantive and inspiring conversation with the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the South at Sewanee. Vice-Chancellor, Ambassador Dr. Reuben Brigety has just been at Sewanee since June. And he has had an amazing experience full of activity. All university presidents do, and his has been unique. He has a national profile, is from my experience and from my values, he's a national treasure because of the way he's leading us in these moments. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Brigety. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you. Let me say one more word of introduction. I think it's important to understand that for 5 years prior to coming to Sewanee, you were the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Prior to that, you were the Prior to that, you were the United States Ambassador to the African Union under President Obama. You're a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, have a doctorate in international affairs at the University of Cambridge. Since you have been at Sewanee, your Board of Trustees has released an amazing statement based in some research from the Roberson Center about the genesis of the University of the South and distancing the current life of the University of the South from that genesis and the values therein. And then there has been an amazingly upsetting period of vandalism at your personal family home there on the domain. And then last month, a lacrosse game had to be interrupted because of some horrible racial epithets that were thrown at the players on the field. So if you don't mind, sir, if you could kind of go over those three things, just describing them, and then we'll certainly go deeper into each one. You don't have to go in depth on each one of them right now.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. And it's been a year. It's been a year. It's been a year for all of us.
Yes.
And it has certainly been a heck of a year to not only start to be a university president anywhere, but also to start to be the first African American vice-chancellor of the University of the South. Let me preface my answers to your question by saying the following. I had a call with a Sewanee alumnus last week from Alabama who graduated in the early 1970s, so half a century ago. And he said to me, Vice Chancellor, how come all it is you seem to be talking about is racism? How come that's all you want to talk about? You don't want to talk about how great Sewanee is or how wonderful it is. All you seem to talk about is racism. And when I was at Sewanee back in 1971, we didn't have any racism. So I don't understand why is this the only thing you're talking about? And so the reason I need to preface that is sort of say two things. So first of all, there are indeed a lot of other really wonderful things that are happening here at the University of the South, not the least of which is that we have managed to remain open for in-person academic education in the midst of a global pandemic of biblical proportions, which is no mean feat and is a direct result of the extraordinary efforts of our staff as well as the cooperation of our students, and it's all been great. It hasn't been without challenge or complaint, but we've done it. Now, having said that, in answer to your three questions about the Roberson Project.
Before you start there, President, I just want to say that when I have read everything I have read in preparation for this interview, I have been amazed at how much copy there is about your promoting how wonderful the University of the South is. And so I'm having a very different perspective than that brother who called you.
But but it's relevant for this conversation.
It is relevant.
Because, we are all have our psyches attuned to different things. to kind of different wavelengths, regardless of what the broader set of things are going on. And that, by the way, is why history matters.
Yes.
Because as we go back to understand the fact pattern of what led us to this moment and to understand a previous historical period on its own merits, the question is, what is the message? What is the signal that emerges from the noise?
Yes.
And that is a function of not only the empirical record at the time, but also the lens that we bring to that record and the particular set of values and understandings that we want to bring from it. And that is central to the question of understanding the Roberson Project and understanding what it means for the University of the South. Now, there is a narrative that has been predominant amongst many people of what I like to call the Sewaneeverse or Swanesians for decades, if not centuries, right? That Sewanee is Arcadia, this glorious nirvana, as some would say, sort of an Episcopal Disneyland on a mountain. That's not my quote, by the way. It's other people said it elsewhere, right? Up here on the Cumberland Plateau that has educated generations of young people, the best of liberal arts, to go off and make their contributions to the world. Now, all of that is true. And
Yes.
there are other truths
Yes.
that lay alongside it.
Yes.
And as I have often said, if any history is relevant, then all of it is. So tell it all. And let us derive from that fuller understanding a full sense of who we were so that we can make affirmative decisions about who we wish to be going forward.
Indeed.
So the Roberson Project, which is named after Professor Houston Roberson, who was the first tenured African American professor at the University of the South, who was in his own right an authority on African American life here on the Cumberland Plateau and as related to the University of the South, has had as its mission to excavate the history of this university with a particular eye to its entanglements with slavery, the Confederacy, the lost cause, and the racial social order underlying all three. And the results from that are stunning. They're stunning for a variety of reasons. One, they're stunning both from both the empirical facts and the inescapable conclusions that come from those facts. And they're also stunning because if you talk to most Sewanee alums who are still alive today, certainly those that have graduated in the last 5 or 6 decades, most would tell you that they are unfamiliar with these facts. Meaning that there was, at a minimum, not an effort prior to the Roberson Project to make these facts clear and to wrestle with what they mean for us and for who we choose to be. So I trust that in the context of distributing this, that your audience will have access to the actual Roberson Project interim report, which one can be found online. But let me just kind of highlight a few things for you that are relevant. First, the raison d'etre for the creation of the University of the South was to create a university that would be a center of learning for young men, and only men at the time, in the South, to help build the region, a region that was dependent, defined by slave labor, and that was meant to be a place of learning for the scions of those great families, as well as for those men who would be trained, educated to continue to uphold and uplift that order. In fact, one can find in the original documents the notion, the viewpoint of the founders, that they actually believed that the University of the South would be capable of creating even greater contributions to mankind as a whole, precisely because the quotidian dirty tasks of the day would be left to the God-ordained inferior, darker races, allowing the white men, the God-ordained superior race, to think greater thoughts and make greater contributions to humanity. As such, the University of the South was the only university in the United States that was created specifically, not incidentally, intentionally, for the purpose of advancing the superiority of a slaveholding culture and the ideology of white supremacy that underlay it. The founding fathers of the university, the trustees and major benefactors, another fact coming from the Roberson Project, held at least 32,000 slaves amongst them, at least. Large swath of land that was acquired, on which the first major parcel was acquired by a man named James Armfield, who at the time was the most profitable and successful slave trader in the United States of America. The University of the South never owned slaves, but it rented some. And in fact, the original clearing of the land prior to the Civil War was done in part with rented slave labor. It's inescapable in both the ideology as well as the practical entanglements that this university had with slavery. Now, after the Civil War, when the university was refounded in 1868, and the question of slavery had been answered fully and convincingly on the battlefield and under law of the country, there was another choice, which was, okay, so what is this university going to be? And it retained the original vision, part of the original vision, which is to create a space for learning for men of the South, which was largely right. We'll get to the men part later in the story. But for a century after the Civil War, the University of the South, in addition to all of the great liberal education that happened, was also a self-styled child of the Confederacy, assertively, and was a place where a series of monuments in partnership with the Daughters of the American Revolution were erected in the early part of the 20th century, where it was a recipient for various artifacts of the old Confederacy, where many of our social organizations and fraternities consistently had a series of traditions that were meant to evoke the Old South, and where integration was bitterly resisted by some of the major benefactors of the university, including Jessie Ball DuPont, who was amongst the most important benefactress of the University of the South from my hometown, Florida, from various vice chancellors, and as late as Vice Chancellor McCready through the late 1970s. And by the alumni and others who were affiliated with the university. Now, it is also fair to say that it was not universal, and that there were those who vehemently wanted to advance the vision of a shared common humanity as taught by their Christian faith here at the University of the South. And that was a struggle. One of the biggest battles of that in relatively contemporary times was the fight to integrate the seminary, the School of Theology, which led to a showdown between the administration, Vice Chancellor McCready, and virtually all of the faculty of the School of Theology, who threatened to resign en masse, and did in principle. It's just that it didn't take into effect. They said they would do it at the end of the year, if the university would not allow students to integrate. And they finally did. They finally admitted two, who graduated in 1960, two of them, Father Joseph Green And regrettably, the other gentleman's name escapes me at the moment, but he subsequently died not long thereafter.
Excuse me, President, that there were students who left en masse as well.
Yes.
At that point, one of my bishops from Mississippi, I had 6 years as the dean of the cathedral in Mississippi, Bishop Gray, who later was the chancellor
Yes.
of the University of the South, was one of the students who left or was kicked out. So I just wanted to insert
theology students. That's very important.
Yes, theology students.
Yes, that's very important. And Bishop Gray's grandson, Peter Gray, is now the university chaplain here at the University of the South, and he is wonderful. As I've told him, he and I embody Dr. King's speech of little black boys and black girls sitting together at the table of brotherhood. He is my brother from another mother, and is a really wonderful, wonderful man.
Give me my love. I will do. I'm devoted to all the Grays.
Sure, I will do. Of the Mississippi Grays. Thank you very much.
All the Mississippi Grays.
Exactly. Happy to. At any rate, so Reverend Green is still alive. In fact, just this past fall, we commissioned a portrait of him that now hangs in the School of Theology. He participated by Zoom from Norfolk, and I said to him in front of all the assembled people around the world that, as far as I'm concerned, you are a new founding father of this university. The battle to integrate the undergraduate program was harder. The university was attempting to get a major foundation grant in the sum of about $2 million that would have fundamentally, and this is all, by the way, information that has been uncovered by the Roberson Project, that was meant to fundamentally, that would have transformed the university. And the foundation said, yeah, but you're actually kind of going really slow on integration. And so they admitted one young man in the fall of 1962, a man named Calvin Williams, who was already a student at Fisk in Nashville, historically Black college in Nashville, transferred here. He wanted to be a physician, studied chemistry. And he was quiet, went about his business, obviously not befriended by anybody, and was here until the spring of 1963, when a senior who was the editor of the school newspaper burned a cross on his lawn in front of his dormitory.
What year?
1963. And Mr. Williams left. The senior was allowed to graduate. The university swept it under the rug. There is no record that the university ever apologized to Mr. Williams, that the university ever said in advance of that they were making an assertive decision to integrate, and that Sewanee gentlemen are to treat each other with dignity and respect. Nothing. Calvin Williams went back to Fisk, graduated, then went on to Meharry, and finished in 1971, a year after my father integrated the University of Florida Medical School and became the first African American to graduate from med school there. Wow. They both went on to be obstetricians. Wow. I've seen a yearbook photo of Dr. Williams. He looks like my dad.
Amazing.
We are told he is still alive, and we're trying to make contact with him,
yeah,
so that we can bring some level of reconciliation to that story. At any rate, so there were two other African Americans who tried to matriculate here, and neither lasted more than a year. And finally, in 1967, there was a football player named Nathaniel Owens who graduated in 1970 and went on to have a distinguished career as a judge in Alabama. So Judge Nathaniel Owens in 1970 became the first African-American undergraduate of the University of the South, a year after Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. It was thus easier, for as long as humanity had been staring into the cosmos, to put a human being on the lunar surface than it was for a descendant of Africa to successfully matriculate from the University of the South.
So important to say.
That's the empirical truth. It is clear. Now, having said that, what do we make of this? And this leads to the next two questions. Because one could say, well, it's history, it's past, it's all good, fine. Here's the thing. There was, for years, a school of thought which suggested that, as soon as you get rid of legal integration, people start going to school to each other. They start to live next to each other, work with each other. Eventually, all this racism stuff will just kind of fade away. It'll all sort of go away naturally. What we are learning, I would submit, is that after 400 years, 4 centuries of a social and economic order that was predicated on white racial superiority and the inferiority of everybody else, as written into law and as impacted over generations, that this is less like a race to be finished and more like a virus that has to be continually addressed in the American body politic. Let me give you some context that helps explain the next 2 questions you've asked with regard to the vandalism at Chen Hall and then subsequently the lacrosse incident. I was born in 1973, which is either just yesterday or ancient, depending on your perspective. But to put it in historical perspective, having been born in 1973, that means that since the first Africans landed on the shores of North America in 1619, I belong to the very first generation of African Americans who were born fully free and equally under the law to all of my fellow citizens. Even people who were born a few years prior to me in the late 1960s cannot assert the same thing. And so what I would submit is happening now, one of the things that is factoring into the societal reckoning that we're facing right now, is that we are at long last having a nationwide conversation amongst equals. I am now 47 years old, wearing a bow tie and trifocal lenses and orthopedic shoes, meaning that I am firmly a pillar of my community, as are so many others who are more or less my age. We know who we are. We have a sense of what we've accomplished. We know what we want to be able to continue to contribute to our country. And we are not prepared to censor ourselves as we try to interrogate the full meaning of our history, and not simply history that happened hundreds of years ago, history that has happened in our lived experience, in our lifetime, the lifetimes of our parents, etc. As an example, as you mentioned, and as was discussed in the Washington Post article, throughout the course of fall of this past fall, 2020, my home, Chen Hall, here at the University of the South, which is the university president's residence, was repeatedly vandalized over the course of the semester, with liquor bottles broken, trash thrown on the lawn, threatening messages put right by our back door. Now, I don't know who did these things. I don't know what their motivations were. They were done anonymously. And by the way, as the person to whom these repeated disrespectful acts were directed, it is not my job to figure out with precision what their motivations were. What I can tell you is that there is a painful, well-documented history of terrorizing Black families under cover of darkness in the American South. Every generation of my family that I have known, myself, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all have had the phantoms come at night for them, at one guise or another, at one time or another, to tell them they didn't belong for whatever reason. I had thought that I had escaped that fate until the year of our Lord 2020 here on this sacred mountain, where the phantoms finally came for my family and me. That is an empirical reality that makes us all uncomfortable, that I know is inconsistent with how the vast majority of the Sewanee community sees itself. And that is also inconsistent with how I have largely, my family have been publicly and warmly greeted. And yet it is true. So what are we to make of this? I can tell you that in the weeks after I gave my growing in grace remarks, there was both simultaneously an outpouring of support, both for us as a family, but also generally speaking, the assertion that we should be living into our values, even as there was also a very vocal counter commentary in various corners of the Sewanee community online and others saying, well, we don't really know what happened, or we don't know, we don't really know who did this. We don't know if it was Sewanee students or people from the community. Maybe it was because of policies that people didn't like the vice chancellor. It had nothing to do with racism, whatever, pick your thing, trying to find a series of ways to explain it, which may have been viable right up until March 13th, which was an incident that occurred during a lacrosse match. Now, for those of you who know anything about the sport of lacrosse, in addition to it being a glorious sport to behold, demographically, it's also very white in the United States. Lots of reasons to explain why that may be the case, but it is. That's just the fact. And so the Sewanee men's lacrosse team is all white. We were playing a college out of Georgia called Emmanuel College, which interestingly actually has a pretty diverse men's lacrosse team. African Americans and Latino Americans, a couple of East Asian Americans, and even a Native American one. Which I say that's quite significant because, of course, lacrosse actually is a Native American sport invented by Native Americans. And so they're coming to play. Because of our COVID protocols, we don't allow non-official visitors to campus. So the only people that were in the stands were Sewanee students. And over the course of the match, by the third quarter, some number of students had repeatedly yelled some number of the most vile racial epithets, to include the N-word, shouted from the stands so they could be heard by the players on the field, that the players on the field complained to their coach, the coach complained to the referee, who demanded that the Sewanee stands be cleared before play could be resumed. I was informed of this basically just as the game was ending, and I rushed to the field before the opposing team, the Emmanuel College team, left. And I did my duty as vice chancellor. I apologized to them. I told them that nobody had the right to undermine their dignity like that, and that we would find those who said those things and we'd hold them accountable. That was my duty as vice chancellor. But as a Black man, having to apologize to other young Black and brown men and take responsibility for the blatant, naked racism of some of our students who were shouting at our visitors, our guests, the same racial epithets that have been shouted to me and my sons over years, was the most distasteful professional duty I've ever had to do in my life. And as I have said to many people in our now here's the important thing that has resulted from that. One, after I informed the community that this happened, they have stood up remarkably to denounce this. We had a spontaneous meeting on the quad that Monday in which students, organized by the students, in which they said, we will not have this, we won't tolerate it here. That Wednesday, all of our student athletes organized a march to the center of campus in the middle of a driving rain to protest racism. numbers of our student organizations, including almost all of our all of our Greek organizations, publicly said and also wrote to me that, we will not have this. What can we do to be part of the solution? We're not having. That's been tremendous. That is something this community can be rightly proud of, and as we continue to do the work to build what Dr. King called the beloved community. It is also true, as I've said to some others, however many number of students did this, we don't, and the investigation is still ongoing. What we do know is that those students felt comfortable enough to shout these epithets, not whisper them, not under the cover of darkness, but to shout them across the field in plain daylight in a crowd of dozens of their peers, and felt comfortable enough to do so without fear of reproach or consequence. And that is a damning indictment of some component, of some aspect of our student body that simply must be confronted. Which brings me back full circle to what we were talking about before. We cannot presume that these sorts of expressions of hatred will simply pass away, will simply wither with time. In fact, like weeds keep cropping up in a garden, like an endemic virus in the body, it has to continue to be confronted. The garden has to be tended. The lawn has to be mowed. The vaccine must be continuously administered so that we can reassert what it means for us all to recognize, respect, and uplift the fundamental human dignity of everyone. That's not just true for Sewanee, that's true for America.
Yes, yes. And for religion in America. And that's where I want to go next, if that's okay.
Sure.
But I can't move there without simply acknowledging what a stunning history lesson you have just expressed. I knew the contours of that. The way, sir, that you have specified the details and the facts, and the way you've linked them and the context you have put them in terms of racism, institutional racism, and systemic racism being a virus and weeds and not a race. That's a very helpful context. So I simply want to stop and acknowledge that. Thank you.
Sure.
Now, a bit of my story, and not much of it. I was assigned a theological narrative when I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church that was pretty blatantly resonant and cheering of the set of values alive in the founding of the University of the South. And because I had the great privilege of a chance encounter with Dr. King before he was assassinated, and then dinner with his father, and then feeling as a very young man enlisted into the movement and committing myself to that all of my adult and professional life. And then making a change into the Episcopal Church and the priesthood. I have been actively involved in a process of re-narrating my theological groundings, re-adjudicating everything that was formative for me in that brand of Christianity. And I have had to come to the very painful understanding which the Roberson Project and also the stance of you and your Board of Trustees have helped to illuminate, that this too is a virus. Not only the lie, which James Baldwin called the lie, the hierarchy of human worth, but that God created it and ordained it that way, which is an even greater lie. And it is a distortion of God and totally antithetical with the person, teachings, and life of Jesus Christ. So I would just love for you, I've got two more questions after this one, and I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I really would love for you, you're a Christian, you are very clearly an Easter-oriented Christian, but please, sir, reflect on how you have understood this religion to which you and I subscribe, Christianity. Were you raised in a Christianity that's just absolutely incompatible with the Christianity I was raised with? Two different universes? Can you just reflect about that, please?
Sure. Then I'll try to be relatively brief on that crucially important question. So the thing that probably makes me even more controversial than being the first Black vice chancellor is that I'm a Presbyterian vice chancellor of the UNB.
That's very, oh my. Ooh, we are getting inclusive.
Exactly. I'm an almost Episcopalian, but that's a story for another day. But I was raised in the Baptist Church. But I was raised in the Black Baptist Church.
Yes.
National Baptist Convention.
Very different.
Which are, and Dr. King famously said the most segregated hour in America are the hours of the church hours between 11 and 12-ish. Right.
Depending on the preacher.
Right. And so I was raised with a Christianity that was not only an Easter Christianity, but an Exodus Christianity.
Yes. Yes.
In which we look to our faith not only for the hereafter, but also for the liberation of the now. I've just finished reading Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, which blew my mind. And it's a relatively quick read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough to anybody who's interested in this essential question, because Thurman's basic premise is that you cannot understand Christianity unless you understand that Jesus was the epitome of the disinherited. A Jew in Roman-occupied Judea, or Roman-occupied, what we now call Palestine, who, by the way, was a Galilean, right? So from the wrong side of the tracks, poor. Did you remember, right, when on the night of his arrest, the Apostle Peter was identified by his accent. You must be a Galilean. I hear that you sound like a Galilean. You must be with this Jesus. And so Thurman's question is, or his assertion is, that you cannot understand Christianity. You can't be a true Christian without understanding and asking the question, what does the walk, the example of Christ and the meaning of his resurrection say to the other disinherited peoples of the world, starting right here in the United States, for purposes of his own cultural presentation. It is breathtaking and eye-opening, precisely because it's almost incontrovertible, based again on the historical record of who we understood Jesus to be, and it is almost seditious is the wrong word, but it is if you accept the worldview, for example, that you were brought up with in your church, then taking a look at your Christian faith anew based on the essential principles that we just articulated cannot do anything other than either cause you to do one of two things: either double down on that because the cognitive dissonance is too painful, or to cause you to upend your worldview and question everything on which you built your faith. Let me say two other things quickly. Esau McCulley, who's a Sewanee grad class of 2008, I believe, who is now a priest in the Anglican Church in North America, and a professor of religion, has this great book out called, let me see if it's Reading While Black. He's been featured in the New York Times, and he has this great piece, that great op-ed in the New York Times that came out last year, is this amazing quote that essentially reads, I'm going to paraphrase it, but essentially reads that the greatest revolution, certainly in American history, is Black people being oppressed in this country and reading in the scriptures testimony to a God who disagreed. Stunning. Absolutely stunning. The final thing I will say is this. 3 years ago, I went to Ghana for the first time and had the opportunity to go to the slave castles on Cape Coast. And standing in the door of no return, looking out on the blue sea, was one of the most profound experiences of my life, as much of a religious experience as anything else I've ever held. You could literally feel the weight of the ancestors in that room. And one of the design features of that slave fort was the chapel, where the Europeans worshiped, that was deliberately built directly atop the slave dungeons, so that the chattel could begin to imbibe the rhythms of the God that they were to worship, that was to be the God of their masters, if they survived the Middle Passage. And one of the things that I said in a sermon that I preached on this subject for Christ Church Cathedral in Nashville last August was, I wonder if that conversation ever went the other way. How could those Christians sitting in that chapel hear the story of Exodus, hear the story of the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, hear the story of the oppressed Jesus, and smell the stench of packed, bruised bodies wafting up through the floorboards in the chapel, and never once come to question it? So what we are seeing now in America is a conversation that's going both ways, that's forcing us to ask some hard questions so that we can collectively come to a greater truth.
Pardon me, but there are moments when I have these interviews where I have to stop and breathe. That's a stop and breathe moment for me, with tears. That the conversation didn't go from the imprisoned to the European freed Christians, but this whole business that not only were those people imprisoned and enslaved beneath that European church, hearing the kind of the flavor and the rhythm and all of that, but also that this God created you inferior and means for you to be enslaved and to go onto this ship. I mean, that is one of the most horrible thoughts I can ever imagine. We have to move on. Thank you for all of this. Before we move on to my concluding questions, and then I do want to see if you have anything to say before we get to the concluding questions, but I do want to say that I have recently, this is addressing people who don't know the history. And you started with the importance of knowing the history and how many, particularly white people, don't know the history of enslavement, Jim Crow, lynchings, segregation, mass incarceration. And I have all these parishioners of mine who are saying, thank you. I get so angry at what I have to unlearn and relearn. And that is precisely the conversation between equals that you were referring to, Doctor. But someone had posed to me, Ed, along this journey you're on, you do have to ask the question, who benefited from your being ignorant about systemic racism and the institutions of racism? And I've had to do an awful lot of soul searching and have come to terms with who did benefit from my being ignorant. And I just wanted to note that because it's a part of the conversation, I think, amongst the equals we're in. Are you ready for my last questions?
Please, yes.
So you are one of our national leaders. And I'm posing to as many national leaders as I can the question of where are we now? You've in part answered that. And then a resonant question, where do we go from here?
Sure.
So could you address that, please, sir?
Sure. Well, where are we now? It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. We are a free people. Thank God. We remain the most wealthy, most powerful country in the world. We are the inheritors of the most profound statement of governing values of a people that I would argue as an American's ever been written, and the oldest constitution in the world. We have demonstrated as a country our ability to continue to close the gap between our professed values and our lived reality. That is all glorious news. And crucially, as a free people, we can choose where we will go. In the worst of times, we have not been this divided politically since the Civil War. Since prior to the Civil War. It's just, I mean, maybe some historian might argue there was some other period, but the point is that's the bar, right? That's where we are. And one of the things that makes these conversations so fraught is that everything becomes politicized. Very basic ideas and very basic concepts that, for example, as brothers and sisters in Christ, who both look to the cross for our salvation, that we all at least ought to be able to come to a very basic understanding about, is caught up in the maelstrom of the political moment. And I am not so naive to believe that, in a sort of Pollyannish kumbaya way, we can all just kind of wash away our differences. That's not the point. We have very real differences, and our founders gave us a structure by which to adjudicate those differences. Although it's worth noting, when they created that structure, only a certain amount of people were allowed into the room to take part of that structure, right? Which gave a certain almost understood set of customs and norms by which to govern ourselves. Now, everybody's part of it, and we have to interrogate that. I operate, one of the ideas we're trying to inculcate here at the University South and with our other sort of peer schools is this very basic idea that we are here to respect, recognize, and uplift human dignity of all, and empowering our students to create the beloved community here and in the world. Here's the thing, that seems like a completely anodyne assertion. Who would disagree with that? Except for the fact that the contestation of that assertion has been at the root of American society, and in particular Southern society, from the beginning, right through the Civil Rights Movement. And so if we believe that, and as Christians, we should, it's in the Book of Common Prayer. How could we not assert the basic humanity of everybody? And ask ourselves, what does it mean to make that more and more real, and to equip ourselves to engage in our society to make it more real, to close the gap between our aspirations and our observations of our lives. And that is not a short task. It's not an easy task, but I will tell you, as in a world where people search for meaning, that is an essential one. And it's a worthy one.
Indeed. So any other words about where do we go from here?
The price of being a free people is that no one is coming to save us. I have spent time in societies that are far more homogenous than ours, that have ripped themselves apart across confessional lines of race, of religion, of clan or tribe. And we have to decide, if as opposed to asserting our profound differences, if we cannot at least come together on some very basic core principles, and figure out how we shape and fashion our communities from our smallest, from our church parishes, our neighborhoods, to schools, right up through our country as a whole, so that we can hold ourselves together and make America anew.
Vice-Chancellor Brigety, I think you're a walking vaccine. I really do. This has been a vaccination that I'm going to promote far and wide, and I hope that you all will want to send the link to your orbit as we do ours. I'm so very grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for being with us. It's been a wonderful time. Continue to join us for Sunday forums, where we hope to continue to illuminate and transform. Have a great day.